Hello, welcome to episode 2 of Lexicon Late Night. I'm your host, David Norcross, here as always with my colleague Justin. Saint-Denis. Today we're going to be talking about one of my favorite authors of all time and another master storyteller, Eric Blair.
Otherwise known as
George Orwell. So George Orwell, obviously the author of 1984 and Animal Farm, which everybody knows him for. But today we're going to talk about a little bit more around those books, like what made him a master storyteller. That's what our lessons for today will be about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the previous episode was all about lessons for business leaders, how to market yourself, how to operate. This time we'll be focusing more on how to communicate. So just how to get your message out there, and then how to write, but also speak clearly and with integrity and in a way that resonates with the audience.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that people get caught up in when it comes to communication is that the technology changes all the time, you know, from papyrus through to the telegram, through to the radio, through to magazines, newspapers, internet.
And TikTok.
Those things are always changing and they will continue to change, but good communication is timeless.
100%.
The same rules that worked 100 years ago, they work just as well now. So let's get into the first one of those rules, which comes from George Orwell's seminal essay, Politics in the English Language.
Yeah, absolutely. Brilliant, brilliant essay. Really the genesis for 1984. He wrote it in 1946. 1984 came out in 1949. And he talks about, in this essay, how people, powerful people, can manipulate language in order to mask the truth. Little things like using the passive voice instead of the active voice. Politicians do this all the time. They'll say, oh, well, mistakes were made, instead of using the active voice like, I made a mistake, therefore showing that you were the one responsible. So you can mask your responsibility. There's a lot going on in this essay, but in particular what we're going to focus on for the purposes of this discussion are Orwell's 6 rules for writing.
Yep.
So let's put them up on the screen.
Okay. All right, so there we go. They are the 6 rules. So the first one is never use a metaphor, simile, or other figure of speech which you are used to seeing in print.
Okay, so this is pretty low-hanging fruit. This will be a piece of cake. We're just going to have to circle the wagons here and figure this one out. So I just broke Orwell's first rule.
Indeed. So why is that breaking the rules? I understand those words. I know what they mean. Why is that a problem?
So the problem with using metaphors that are overused, metaphors, similes, or other figures of speech, is that they become cliches. And when you use a cliche, it loses all of its actual impact because you're just resorting to thinking that somebody else did a long time ago, and then people have repeated that. And so now it becomes devoid of any substance. So when you do that, you just sound unoriginal, you sound derivative. And this is one of the points that we try to make consistently on this show and in Lexicon in general. If you want to stand out from the competition, you have to be unique. If you want to grab people's attention, you need to earn it. And if you're just using the same figures of speech that other people are using, people are just going to tune you out. People are smart, and they'll instinctively just be like, this guy's not worth listening to.
Exactly. So and this applies to any part of writing, but especially to captions. So if you're writing a caption, you have to catch attention, you have to catch it quickly. And something that's unusual generally is going to catch attention better.
Right. The whole point of metaphors is that they're supposed to illustrate what you're thinking in a way that nobody else has ever thought of before, but it immediately clarifies things. So if you do use an unusual metaphor as an opening sentence in a caption, that'll immediately, people are like, whoa, what is this?
Yeah, you got to stop and try and figure out what's going on.
Yeah, so rule number 1, what's rule number 2?
So rule number 2 is never use a long word where a short word will do.
Yes, okay, so utilize, well, I'm not going to be as good as the first one, but yeah, people try to make themselves sound more intelligent than they are by using big words.
Indubitably, yes.
Yeah, indubitably, leverage, utilize, just say use. Now we're getting into my own pet peeve here. But, okay, when you're communicating to a wide audience, it's important, especially here in Thailand, some of them, English might not be their first language. You have to communicate, you have to be empathetic towards your audience. And so to show that, communicate clearly. Don't use big words when a short one will do, because you're just being a discourteous writer. If you're making things like clear writing, and this is something that Orwell gets into in the essay, clear writing, good writing is when you take a complex thought and make it easy to understand. If you take something that's easy to understand and make it complicated, you're just a jerk. Like you're what a jerk.
Back to norm.
Back to norm. But you're just being a bad writer, even if you think that makes you sound smart. And what happens is one of two things. One, they're not going to understand you, and they're going to be frustrated, and then they're not going to listen to you. Or two, they will understand you, but they're going to see right through you because they go like, well, this guy's he's a pedant. He's being condescending, or he's being, like I can see through it, and so they're going to dismiss you.
Absolutely. And again, this comes back to, Orwell obviously wrote this about authors writing long form books, but it's so true when it comes to short form content. Like if you're writing a caption on Facebook, LinkedIn, or wherever it might be, the more complicated it is, the less chance people are going to stop and read it because they won't understand it. They'll just skip it. If it looks like it's not made for me, why should I look at it? So, it's pretentious to show off.
So, speak in everyday language. Speak in the language that people they speak in, and then they'll relate to it. But don't be pretentious, which is kind of a long word.
Yeah, and it's pretentious to show off. I think I'm breaking rule 1 and 2.
Yeah.
All right, so on to rule 3. If it's possible to cut out a word, always cut it out.
Yeah, sure. I think this one, we don't need to go too far into it. It's pretty self-explanatory. An example of this would be in order to. You can usually just say to.
Yeah, keep it simple. Don't over egg the pudding.
There you go. Is that an overused metaphor?
I don't think it is.
Okay, there you go. See? An uncommon metaphor. Don't over egg the pudding. Now I understand what he's saying more clearly. This is good.
Are you sure?
Yeah. That's very British.
It is. Never use the passive where you can use the active.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned this off the top. Like, okay, first of all, it should be, active voice. The dog bit the man, supposed to the man was bitten by a dog. It's just clearer and it's a more efficient form of communication. But like I mentioned earlier, so when you use the passive voice, you can hide the actor. So you can say things like mistakes were made, or casualties were incurred, or other kinds of political type language where you're trying to hide who is at fault or who's responsible.
Justin was listened to.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. So
by at least hopefully some people online.
At least 1 million people, sure.
Oh yeah.
So absolutely, passive voice is bad writing because it just makes it harder to figure out who's doing what.
Yeah,
just
exactly.
Keep it simple. You don't deserve people to have to work hard to figure out what you're trying to say.
There are exceptions, which we'll get into later. But the man was hit by a train. It's a very passive thing. The train isn't really an actor. So in that case, you could probably use a passive voice.
Yeah.
I'm muddying the waters now.
All right. Number 5, never use a foreign phrase, a scientific word, or a jargon word if you can think of an everyday English equivalent. So just use the language of the common man.
Yeah, English. I'm trying to think of, there's so many examples of this in the corporate world, especially.
For sure, especially
future-proof.
Yeah, and in terms of jargon, all of the acronyms and all kind of things. I think we were looking at a brief earlier today, which was full of such language.
Yeah, exactly. So just keep in mind that not everybody knows your insider terminology. And it might be a little bit more work to think, okay, well, how do I say this in everyday speech? But it's worth it because more people are going to understand you, and that's the whole point of communicating, is people understanding you.
Absolutely, and it's back to the same rules again. Like, if you're using complicated words, you're definitely going to lose some of your audience, and your purpose of writing is to try and catch the attention of your audience. So don't risk them not understanding what you're trying to say, because then you're failing in your core objective. Don't use a complicated scientific word, keep it simple, and it's a pet peeve of mine. You're bilingual, so it's different for you, but people throwing in French words or Italian words into an article, like, I don't know what that means. Like, this is an English language newspaper, The Guardian.
Right. Well, not like common things like déjà vu or like raison d'être. Yeah. I always feel weird whenever these French terms come up in English, because I can speak French, but I don't want to say it with a French accent because then I sound pretentious. Like, I'm just trying to show off. Like, oh, well, that's my whole raison d'être.
I like it though. I'm sure the ladies like it too.
I'm sure they do. Nothing sexier than a French-Canadian accent.
Rule 6 is break any of these rules sooner than say anything outright barbarous.
See, this is funny because he's breaking his own rule on purpose here by using the term barbarous.
Indeed.
So he's, case in point. But like we've kind of mentioned before, these rules are guidelines. There's no firm, you have to say this. You can't ever use a foreign word. You can't ever use the passive voice. You can't ever say in order to instead of just to. Sometimes it just feels better and sounds better to throw in these things.
Sure.
So, stick to the rules as much as you can, but occasionally there's room for flourish and creativity and storytelling and all the rest of it. So don't stifle yourself, but keep in mind who you're speaking to.
And as we're going to see later on, he broke all those rules for 1984. He created his own words, he made his own universe, he made his own language. So this is the basis for quality writing. But what we're going to look at next is where Orwell got his ideas from to some degree, or where he did his background. So lesson 1, clear communication. Keep it simple, don't be pretentious, and try to engage in, especially when you're writing captions, that first sentence of your caption, keep it very short, very simple, provocate, get people to pay attention and get them to read more. That's the key point of any marketing.
Yeah, provocate though?
Provoke.
Okay. Provoke. Well, this is going to turn in, we're going to be trying to out Orwell each other here.
Yes, indeed, provoke.
This is a recipe for an interesting show. But we've got other things to discuss here other than writing tips, right?
We do.
So this does create the foundation for his approach to writing, his approach to storytelling. But what we're going to talk about next here.
So one of the brilliant things about Orwell, so Orwell stands alone as the best author of the 20th century, from the UK at least.
Yeah, best English language author. Everything's debatable, but he was a titan, not just of as a writer, but just as a human being. The guy had principles that were just unshakable, and he stuck to them. And he was really just like an intellectually honest individual and an extremely courageous individual. I don't know if we have time for this little tangent, but this is a quote from Christopher Hitchens, another fantastic English author, talking about Orwell, saying that he got all 3 of the major questions of the 20th century correctly. Number 1, colonialism and imperialism, which he wrote about extensively, speaking out against it. Second, fascism. He didn't even write about that. He just picked up a gun and went and fought in the Spanish Civil War, fighting the fascists. And then number 3, communism, which we'll get into later.
In Animal Farm, of course.
Yeah, and 1984.
Yes, so second lesson is about expertise. So if you want to succeed, especially when it comes to thought leadership or executive positioning or any of those things, you can't really fake it. You have to do the work. You have to really understand your topic. You have to be an expert. And I don't know of any person who did it as well as Orwell.
Yeah, so Down and Out in Paris and London, and Road to Wigan Pier as 2 examples.
And Homage to Catalonia.
So he actually went and lived as a tramp?
Yes, yes. So during the Great Depression, he went to live in France.
Is tramp okay to say?
I think it is.
It's an English word.
It is, yeah, it's an English word. Yeah. So he went to work in Paris as a teacher, and then the Great Depression hit. He ended up working in a restaurant of a big expensive hotel, but just in the basement. It was horrible, working long hours, low pay, and it sucked. He was down and out in the sense that he was living on the breadline. It was terrible. Came back to London, and then he, to some degree by choice, because he was an Etonian, he was from a wealthy family, but he decided not to take charity and lived as a homeless guy for a period of time.
That's wild. In the 30s.
In the
correct?
30s, yeah.
It was actually, there were a lot of homeless people at that time.
England's bloody cold. I wouldn't want to be living on the streets.
Imagine Canada as a homeless guy.
Yeah. So he wrote this, seminal book, which is not one of his most famous books, but it's really fascinating insight into his character. Like, he wanted to understand the struggle of the poor. Genuinely.
So are we saying here that business leaders should experience some time as homeless people?
Yes, that is the lesson for today. No, but he lived as a homeless guy. He went to fight in the Spanish Civil War, as you mentioned. He wrote a book called Homage to Catalonia. He got to see close up communism and fascism and truly understand it, not just from an academic perspective. And he broke kind of the rules of the well-to-do Southerners. He was a posh boy, went to Eton. He was a rich kid. But he went to live with coal miners in Wigan, also in the 1930s, and experienced their lives. And he didn't airbrush it. He was like, he wrote about how terrible it was, how they died of the black lung, how they were stupid and they were smelly potentially, but
that's an interesting point that I think we should linger on, is that oftentimes socialists are of the intellectual class, and so they're elites. And so they see the working class through kind of romantic, rose-colored lenses, and they think, well, these people are going to save us. Meanwhile, none of them have spent any time with the working class, and if they did, maybe wouldn't like them, and the working class probably wouldn't like these effete intellectuals either.
Absolutely. So it's incredibly honest of Orwell to kind of acknowledge that yeah, exactly as you said, right? They don't like us, and we don't really like them very much. Like how are we going to build this class alliance of the bourgeoisie to overtake the ruling class with the proles, essentially, if we don't like them? And he made that point very clearly. So he was really iconoclast, and I'm breaking one of his rules there, I'm sure. But he was very much against the system, but he was against all forms of what you're supposed to do. He was just an honest man.
Yeah, I think that's the key point there is just intellectual honesty and courage, really. But I think the larger point you're making here is that to be a good, credible communicator, you need to be an expert in your subject matter.
Absolutely. You got to do the research, you got to do the hours, and then you've got to actually know what you're talking about. And thought leadership, by definition, is a display of your subject knowledge. You're literally leading conversation, and you can't really fake that. So if you're a business leader, you need to either be displaying the knowledge and wisdom that you have, or at least you need to be having an expert outsourced storytelling agency supporting you with that.
Yeah, if that's a well put. Sure.
Do you know any of those?
Yeah, no. There's plenty of good outsourced marketing firms in Bangkok.
How many of them have late night shows though?
Only one, as far as I'm aware of. No, but seriously, the point you're making is a good one. I mean, it is a little funny how hard you kind of sold Lexicon on that. I don't know how Orwell would feel, but no, if you want to be seen as, if you got to show your expertise, and if you don't actually have that expertise, you need to provide value to the audience.
Yeah.
And so obviously business leaders are super busy. They've got other things to do. They've got to focus on the big picture, the company culture, leading the organization, all of this very important stuff. But you still need to be communicating to your audience, and you need to be really showing your in-depth expertise, showing that you really know what you're talking about. So if you don't have time for that, you've got to hire people that will do the work. And now I'm doing the same thing.
So the key lesson is nobody deserves an audience. Like just because you write a blog or you make a video, you don't deserve an audience. You have to earn it. So you got to communicate well. You got to know your subject. That's it.
Yeah, that's it. Show your expertise. And if somebody within your organization will have expertise.
I hope. Yes.
I certainly hope so.
All right. So now we've got the technical skills, we've got the research. Now we see Orwell truly coming into his own.
Right.
He spent all of these years dedicating himself to his craft, both technically and anthropologically.
Sure.
Doing the ethnography.
Yeah, there you go.
And now he's ready to put out his best work. So first of all, Animal Farm. So the lesson here is just going to be a great storyteller. Leader of your field. Like he was the best. And because of these other things that he did, he was able to really display storytelling magnificence and shine.
Yeah. Animal Farm is an interesting one. Like I think I read it in high school, and it's just an allegory. And it's kind of funny because people like animals, and you think it's going to be kind of a pleasant tale, and it really is not. It's an absolutely tragic tale. But it wasn't popular at the time. It wasn't well received. People weren't even, he struggled, if I'm not mistaken, struggled to find publishers for this book, right?
Well, I think we're going to end up with the same lesson that we always end up with here, to be honest. We're going to end up with the lesson of don't pander. Because he was just a brilliant person. Like, he went and fought in the Spanish Civil War, so he'd seen communism close up, where most people who were communists in the 1930s or whatever, they hadn't really experienced Russian communism yet. They just thought capitalism bad, therefore communism is good. So they didn't really have the insight that he did. So he'd heard about the realities of communism and the lies of, you know, equality and the lies of the Stalinism. So he was able to tell an allegory that was basically a true story, but in the form of animals.
Right. All animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. Iconic line, very funny, but also tragic, and really, really encapsulates the problem of Soviet-style communism.
Exactly. So he wrote the book during the peak of the Second World War, when Russia and the UK and the US were allies.
Yeah.
So his publisher wouldn't publish it.
Right.
Because
kind of understandable, because it's wartime and one enemy at a time here.
Yeah, it's a book about pigs, though.
Yeah. But hey, we got to watch out for these pigs, especially that Snowball.
Indeed, he was a bad dude.
Yeah, but it's brilliant. It just shows, okay, you overthrow a system, and then whoever ends up in charge of that system, if you don't have certain fundamental principles in place, you're just going to become just as bad as the previous master, if not far worse.
So he was absolutely true to himself. He went against his publisher, who was a communist. He went against the government, who was very much friends with Russia at that time. But he knew what was true, and he published it. And eventually, when it came out after the alliance was over, it did become popular. It was his most successful book by far at that time, because communism of Russia was now an enemy. You know, the Cold War started pretty much as soon as the Second World War ended.
Yeah. And that actually, so Animal Farm is the precursor.
Yes.
Animal Farm is pretty short, and then the precursor to obviously his most famous book, 1984.
Yeah, so he took all of these lessons of everything he'd learned, just the clear communication, the powerful metaphors, the understanding of communism and capitalism and fascism and society, and just all of that life of iconoclasm and wisdom and experience, and he turned it all into this brilliant book.
Yeah, maybe my favorite book of all time. I mean, it's very stark, and it's harsh, and it's certainly not a happy ending.
No.
But it's just gripping, super compelling writing. I remember I was about 19 when I read it for the first time. And I was on my way to Northern Ontario to work as a tree planter. We don't really need to get into the details, but I was on the bus it's a 12-hour bus ride from Ottawa to Sudbury, Ontario. And I was with my buddy Tyler, and we were going tree planting together. And he was really excited, and I'm normally a very talkative guy, but I just started reading 1984, and the entire bus ride I didn't say a word to him, because I was just like glued to the pages of the book. It's just so compelling. Like, even the first line, I'm probably going to screw it up a little bit, but it was a bright, cold day in April, and the clocks were striking 13. Immediately, you're like, okay, this is not the world that I know. There's something crazy going on here. And I immediately identified with Winston Smith. I was 19 at the time. Now I'm a lot more like him in his 30s, going bald, and he's got all these like physical ailments and stuff. I don't have a varicose ulcer, but yeah, I immediately just identified with this guy and what he was going through in this society where you don't get to, you have no privacy and no freedom. I'm kind of just rambling here, but
it's a different lesson from Norm, though, right? Norm when we did the Norm episode, it was 3 distinct lessons. And these are all kind of like cumulative. They build on each other to get to this conclusion that if you put in the work he did, the technical knowledge of your industry that he had, you can produce masterpieces, or you can outsource to an agency.
Right, sure. We'll write 1984 for you.
Yeah.
It'll be double plus good.
I'm sure Steve could probably write 1984.
I don't know about that. I mean, Yeah, okay. Sure. Yeah, we've got this talent in-house.
Yes, indeed. Indeed. All right, so summing up with Orwell then, what are the core lessons that businesses can take from George?
Okay, well, number one, write or speak, communicate clearly. You don't have to follow his rules exactly, but his rules are really a good guideline, especially as David was saying earlier, for writing social media captions. They've got to be punchy, they've got to be thought-provoking, they've got to grab your attention. And use the active voice, don't use jargon, don't use weird metaphors. Write clearly and be courteous to your audience. That's a bit convoluted, but that's number one, communicate clearly. Number two, know your stuff. And if you don't, do your research, and if you don't, hire somebody who will do it for you. And then number three is just use the summation of all of your skills that you've collected throughout your life, and use that to produce something brilliant. So really just storytelling.
Is this on 1984, Justin?
I don't think so. This is more like one of his essays in The Guardian or something. It's not bad.
Yeah,
it's not a masterpiece.
Yeah, I'm sure in 100 years people will be taking these 3 lessons.
Yeah, of course. There's going to be some kid on a bus who's watching this instead of talking to his buddy.
Indeed. All right, so thank you for tuning into episode 2. Episode 3 coming very soon, which is going to feature another one of the greatest storytellers of all time. Stay tuned, and we'll be back very soon.